welcome to another episode of Well, Don't Tell the Kids. I'm Janet Lee, your host, and today I'm speaking with my guest, Sabrina Siddiqui. I wanted to welcome you to the podcast, Sabrina.
Thanks for having me.
Sabrina is currently a political reporter for The Guardian, and she's covering the White House and national politics. So I wanted to roll back a little bit and go to the start of your journalism endeavor and start at education. Were you always interested in journalism?
Well, I decided I wanted to be a reporter when I was 13 years old, and I had a keen interest in writing from a young age, but I had a few family members who were reporters and got me interested in more journalistic writing, and I did what a lot of Medill students do, which is edited my high school newspaper, wrote for it, and started to harness that interest so that maybe I could apply to journalism school. In fact, I first wrote Bollywood movie reviews, so very different from what I do now, and I would submit those to a bunch of South Asian websites, and was lucky enough to have some of them printed in addition to working on my high school paper. And so I applied to Northwestern directly to Medill, and that I was a freshman in the fall of 2004. Which now feels like a lifetime ago. And it definitely was a very interesting introduction to journalism, because you do start with the basics and with just the who, what, when, why, and where of journalism and how to write a story. And eventually, as we were given the opportunity, I chose to focus on magazine writing. And that, too, has changed dramatically, because within the 4 years alone that I was at Northwestern from 2004 to 2008, you had the rise of digital media, and a lot of the landscape for reporting change upon my graduation. And so I'll get more into, I'm sure, in the conversation how I got to where I am now. But I am very lucky to say that, you know, at age almost 33 in a week, I'm now doing what I've wanted to do for the last 20 years.
I know Medill has a strong internship program, from what I recall. Around the graduation time, did you spend some time in downtown Chicago?
So I did write while I was there. There were some assignments we were given as part of class that were requiring us to go out into the city and to get off campus and actually try as student reporters to get real experience on the ground. But then the most prominent, I think, program which still exists, it's just that the name has changed over time, was teaching media. That's what it was called when I was there. Now I believe it was changed to journalism residency, JR, and I think that's still the name. And essentially students would pick one quarter, since we were on the quarter system, and you would rank where you would want to intern during those 3 months and hope that you would get placed at one of your top choices. And it was a wide range of newspapers, magazines, broadcast, radio, local, national. And I was lucky that I had wanted to intern at Business Week and was able to do so, since I was at that point in time. I did my teaching media, now JR, senior year, fall quarter. So at that point I was effectively a magazine writing major within Medill, and or that was my concentration. And so I went to New York City for 3 months as a 21-year-old, and I
jumped right in there.
Right, and I definitely found it to be a very overwhelming but also eye-opening experience, in that you're there in this massive newsroom, and there's a weekly magazine that's put out, and there's a lot of activity around all of the various sections, and I was put under the stewardship of an editor, Louis Lavelle, who would write the book every year that ranks business schools. And so I worked on the book with him, learned about how that process works, and then would also pitch to some of the editors on the desk in the hopes that lucky me could get a byline, if not in the magazine, then maybe on the website, because at that point they had also started to build out a website, which was new at the time. Now that's probably where most of the work goes for any news organization, but at that time it was still a fairly new thing, and gave young up-and-coming reporters like me a chance to actually get some clips that maybe we wouldn't have otherwise gotten in the age of print.
So then you had a successful internship and then graduated and then went on to, were you first at Bloomberg News upon graduation?
So I had a very interesting task because I didn't go into journalism right away. I graduated in 2008, and it was a really, really difficult year to graduate. Obviously, that's an understatement with the financial crash. That directly impacted my graduating class because we were the ones who would have been looking for jobs during that 2007 through 2008 school year, academic year. And even in journalism, because of the advent of digital media, a lot of print outlets, from newspapers to magazines, were really undergoing significant losses. They were still trying to figure it out. It doesn't sound that long ago, 2008, 10 years ago, to think that it was still overwhelmingly print, like 80-20, 80%, 20%. Now it's, what is it, the other way, probably a direct opposite. And so when I was looking for jobs, especially having had a keen interest in magazine writing, even where I interned Business Week and was undergoing difficulties, so was Newsweek and Time and all of these emblematic magazines of American journalism. And so I just actually took a job at a pharmaceutical trade organization in Washington, D.C. That's how I ended up in D.C., called the National Pharmaceutical Council. And it was just a stable job in healthcare, which was one of the few stable industries. And it was as a research associate, just doing research on the projects that they would do. It was essentially a group that did research for medical journals and white papers. And I thought, well, at least a job on the table, and I can make it what I'll make it. And so I moved out to the D.C. area, and I also found it to be compelling because it was the year that they were debating the health care law, the Affordable Care Act, when I started in January of 2009. And that at least gave me some area that I could maybe develop some expertise in, still wanting to one day go back into journalism, and certainly that would be topical for many, many years to come. And what I did at that job, and my advice often to young people is, don't necessarily say no to a job because it's not the job that you want. When I was there, I launched a trade newsletter for our group, for our organization, which then would go out to healthcare stakeholders once a month. And I was the one who authored and edited that newsletter and conceptualized it. I launched our social media platforms, from Twitter to, whatever else, LinkedIn, Facebook. So I was able to kind of modernize that aspect of the way that they ran their communication shop, all of which are tools that obviously would eventually serve me well in media, which is where I wanted to be. And so I did that job actually from January 2009 all the way until August 2011. And in 2010, I got an opportunity from Bloomberg to work at their White House desk on the weekends and weeknights. And so that was to be in the White House press. So I'm happy to talk more about that experience, but it meant that I was working two jobs at once in order to get my foot back in the door in journalism. And essentially at the Bloomberg gig, which we can get into more detail about, I would basically assist the White House reporters by taking on shifts on the weekends and weeknights occasionally to monitor what then President Obama was doing, and essentially being part of the press pool that follows him around and just reporting back any news to the desk that would then go into wire copy. This was Bloomberg, the wire service, not Bloomberg Politics, which didn't exist at the time.
Very good advice that I've heard many times from my guests, to just basically get in there and work towards, obviously you're doing research and early adaptation of some of the social media platforms. Can you recall something that may have happened on a weekend?
Well, obviously, if you compare the Obama administration to the Trump administration, it seems like day and night in terms of the pace of news. But when we were covering the President Obama, then President Obama, we would remark about how crazy things seemed, because it's all relative, right? And so one of the bigger, I think, storylines that we were covering, because I started doing that gig for Bloomberg in March of 2010, that was, of course, a catastrophic midterm election year for Democrats. And so they lost the House, and then Republicans came into control of at least one chamber of Congress. And the storyline then continued to be all of these potential shutdowns. There was a debt ceiling crisis in 2011, and there was always some sort of cliff where if they didn't meet a certain fiscal deadline, then there would be ensuing economic calamity. And just the dynamic between President Obama and Republican leadership on Capitol Hill, his efforts to get a grand bargain with former House Speaker John Boehner. So it was actually a little bit busier than we anticipated. And then there was, I think, the probably more telling, I think one of the more telling, or not telling, I should say, one of the more prominent storylines was the operation in Libya in 2011. So there was a lot. I still remember being there for the speech in which the president laid out the military operation in Libya and the rationale for military intervention. But I would say the most unpredictable weekend was, of course, when we were at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and I was part of the pool, and we didn't think that anything was necessarily afoot because the president is there laughing and joking with, the comedian, and next thing you know, that was Saturday night and Sunday. Yeah, there was apparently a raid that was going on behind the scenes. This is, of course, in 2011, and the press pool gets called back to the White House for unknown reasons, and slowly, the news gets out that there had been a successful raid to kill Osama bin Laden. And that, I think, then caused those of us who were in the pool on Saturday night at that correspondence dinner to really comb back through all the details of that night and to think about what, if anything, was unusual about the president's movements. And I, at that time, had such a clear sense of his schedule because when you're going there every weekend, you know when are Sasha and Malia's basketball games, when does he usually play golf. I still remember very specifically that there was an early morning call time for the pool on Sunday. I don't remember the exact time, but I remember it was unusual. It was too late for him to go to church. But Sunday, his daughters never had games. Too early for him to golf. And we didn't know why they wanted the pool to assemble at the White House early on a Sunday morning after the correspondence dinner. In the end, the president went to play golf, and that was highly unusual for him to do that early on a Sunday, but it turned out that was because he wanted to clear his head as this raid was kicking off. So that's just how fascinating that job was, is you really learn about how a president operates and what might be happening behind the scenes and how to spot the smallest detail that tips you off to something unusual being afoot.
Let's see. We're almost to present time. As a reporter for Huffington Post, still covering the White House and also presidential races. So why the shift, and how did you get to that point?
Well, I wasn't full-time at Bloomberg News. I was a stringer who worked part-time where I was there every weekend and weeknights a few times a week, but I wanted to be a reporter. And so occasionally I was lucky I would get a byline at Bloomberg if I had fed some color or news back to the desk that showed up in wire copy. But I was still ultimately in a supporting role and young, and so I wanted to actually cut my teeth in more of a reporting capacity. And one of the good things about being in the press pool at Bloomberg was it gave me the opportunity to meet a lot of other reporters who were there on pool duty and network and really try to get my name out there as someone who is at least, there at the White House, getting to know the officials there covering that beat. And I got an opportunity from the Huffington Post to join them for their 2012 cycle and to be a full-time reporter. And so it was an opportunity I couldn't really refuse. And I was primarily tasked with first starting up the election blog there, which would run every day, Monday through Friday, and start first thing in the morning and spot those early news lines, everything from a new political ad to fundraising numbers to, a line of attack from either campaign and also capturing congressional races. And then I was covering the Romney campaign on the road. So it was sort of a combination of both, where I would go out maybe once a week with the Romney campaign, do a story from the campaign, as well as by spending a few days in one of the battleground states and capturing maybe the mood of the electorate. The Obama re-election campaign I also covered insofar as there was a two-way race. So if you're covering one side, you also end up covering the other. But I did that through the general election. I joined HuffPost in May of 2012. So at that point, the general election was almost underway. Mitt Romney had all but secured the nomination. And then after the election, I covered Congress. And I covered Congress in its relationship with the Obama administration. That was arguably the busiest time, even by current standards, because as soon as the election was over, you had the fiscal cliff of 2012, the deadline to extend the Bush tax cuts. You went into 2013 and you had sequestration, those arbitrary cuts that kicked in, and you had the government shutdown of 2013 over Obamacare. There was Sandy Hook, the shooting, and the first major gun control debate in its aftermath. The immigration debate of 2013, where they passed the massive overhaul in the Senate, which of course went nowhere in the House, but has been a seminal moment still. So, and that all led into the 2014 midterm. So I think that it was, I was at HuffPost from 2012 to early 2015 before I joined The Guardian. Probably had one of the more expansive reporting experiences I've had insofar as all the different aspects of politics that I covered. And Congress, I always say, for anyone interested in political reporting, is probably the most educational experience you could have in terms of really learning how the government actually works, how laws are actually written, just the dynamics in terms of the politics between the two chambers and the White House, and understanding the rules and how much power senators have versus House members and what drives them, what doesn't. So I think that to me is always what I say for anyone who wants to learn the 101 of politics. They should land a reporting gig in Congress.
Now, you switched over to the Guardian, which is paper originating out of the UK. How was that? What was the decision process there, and what are the differences covering? I mean, you're now looking at it from an international point of view.
Well, I would say that it was certainly taking more of a 30,000-foot view once I joined The Guardian. I joined them in March of 2015, right as the 2016 presidential race was kicking off. Ted Cruz launched his campaign maybe a week after I got there. So in some ways, I would say it wasn't necessarily different from the get-go in that we were focused on the presidential race, and we were out there just like anyone else on the road. I was gone for the greater part of 18 months from March 2015 through November 2016. I was covering Marco Rubio at first, and then I covered Hillary Clinton, and we were there almost every day with everyone else, reporting on what was happening in the campaigns, as well as finding those stories on the ground that maybe told something a little bit more compelling and outside of the national narrative. But one thing that I learned early is I don't think this is useful just for an international audience, but frankly for even a broader, wider American audience.
Sure.
A lot of the political reporting has become what I would refer to as for Washington, by Washington. Mm-hmm. And so it's very much centered on inside the Beltway and reaching influencers in politics. And the intended audience, not for everyone, but for a lot of people, is increasingly the power players in Washington. And people who are very politically engaged as readers, people who are junkies. But the majority of the public does not operate that way. And so the audience I was writing for at The Guardian, while it may be more international than it had been at the Huffington Post or even Bloomberg, it was still probably in line with how a lot of Americans consume political news, which is not inherently knowing what all these internal dynamics mean, or not necessarily being interested in inside baseball palace intrigue day in and day out. Certainly sometimes they want to know about the cast of characters, maybe in the White House or somewhere else, but they want to understand what this all means and why it matters to them, and what it means for them. And so I think that skill at The Guardian is something that applies not just in a global audience that is a few steps removed, but also most of the country that is also a step or two removed from Washington, to say the least. And so my editor explained it to me as thusly, because I came from covering Congress and very used to competing with Politico at HuffPost, where I went straight into what aides are saying on Capitol Hill and what the tools at their disposal that they're trying to use to maybe delay a bill or not bring it to the floor. And it just went right into that dynamic that we report on when we're covering Congress. And my editor took that one of those stories I wrote in the beginning at The Guardian and said, if you went out to dinner with your friends and you were to describe what you were covering today, how would you describe it to them? Because I feel like you wouldn't use this language.
Right.
And that's how I want you to write this story. If you were just stepping outside of the hallways of the Senate, how would you describe this story to anyone else? And that was the approach that I think that they had me take at The Guardian that is instructive in more ways than just an international audience being at our core.
So at a recent panel discussion, the National Press Club, you said, I'm paraphrasing here, that I just recall from listening, that the way journalists cover the news and the governing ethics of news coverage should not be altered depending on who is being covered. That just really struck me. And so sort of on the a question that is kind of a little counterpoint, as recently as this week, one of the news outlets, a major news outlet, did not cover a White House press briefing. So I wanted to know, can you make comment about what an editor or a desk chief would grapple with when making a decision of covering or not covering?
Particularly in the Trump era?
Yes. I think, yeah.
I would say that I think the biggest challenge for all of the press corps covering the White House and just the current climate is figuring out how to break through, how to be distinctive and not just chasing every shiny object. And the challenge has been that on any given day, there can be at least 12 headlines that come out of the White House alone. Mm-hmm. Every hour, if not more than that, there could be a new line. And there's tweets, there's comments made on the South Lawn, there's policy that just comes without any warning, there's firings that happen seemingly on a whim, and there's a lot of drama. And so how do we lead the conversation rather than chase it is the question we've all been asking ourselves. And it's not just at The Guardian. I know this is the same conversation when I talk to colleagues and friends in the media more broadly, be it at the New York Times or Washington Post or at CNN or NBC or at The Atlantic, or it could be at the Huffington Post or they could be at the Daily Caller. Everyone is sort of trying to figure out how do you take a step back and take stock of what really matters in the scheme of things at a time when the pace is just so rapid. I don't know that anyone after nearly 2 years of the administration has actually figured it out, but in some ways you're starting to see people say that they're not necessarily going to, and this is more speaking to networks, they're not necessarily going to carry every speech of the president's live. They've stopped doing that. Sometimes they'll break in, but they don't carry all the campaign rallies live anymore. Or maybe they won't take the briefing live. Maybe a lot of news organizations will say, we're not going to write a story off of every briefing, which are increasingly scarce to begin with. We don't necessarily need to cover a policy announcement that is mostly filled with talking points but no real substantive plan. And if they're not willing to actually tell us what they're doing that's new or different, and they're just put out a vague infrastructure plan or whatever you might call it, just so they could say that they've done something, that doesn't mean that we write it up as what would amount to then a press release. We might have to ask this, be a little bit more, apply a little bit more scrutiny than we did before. And so sometimes they get frustrated because they say we're not covering what they're doing, but they haven't been able to prove that they're actually doing something. So that's kind of the back and forth that we have. But it's not easy. It's not easy. I think that a lot of reporters have alarms set for 5 a.m. and every half hour or so, or every 15 minutes or so, anticipating the president's tweets. Some of them have alarms that are tied to those tweets specifically. You just don't know what you're going to get.
Yeah, yesterday was a busy day.
Mm-hmm.
It was a busy day in the news cycle.
That was where Michael Cohen, the president's former personal attorney, pleaded guilty to lying to federal investigators about business dealings in Moscow during the 2016 campaign. And that's another challenge, is you have this Russia investigation that has loomed as a cloud over this presidency since day one. And you have to be very cautious because there are people who have a vested interest in putting out a narrative. And so sometimes you'll have maybe people from the president's legal team who are leaking things with motivation. Sometimes you have people elsewhere who are leaking documents or just information but filtered, hoping that they can dictate the narrative. In some ways, that's what happened with the Hillary Clinton email saga, which I think that the media did get wrong in large part around the release of the letter by James Comey 11 days before the election, where everyone ran with it not knowing what was actually in it. All we knew is that Comey had sent a letter to Congress saying that that the FBI had discovered more emails and that they were going to investigate those emails, sort of reopening the investigation into her use of a private service Secretary of State. But in the end, after 3 days in a fairly rushed review process because of the election looming, they found that they were all duplicates and that there were no new emails. So, what the media had done by that point was already paint this portrait of an investigation that had been reopened, a criminal investigation, and some people went so far as to say that really did significant damage so soon before an election. Now, that's not the only reason that Hillary Clinton lost, but there is some introspection that the media has to do when you really push forward with a narrative and you don't actually yet know, because we're in this really rapid pace in this 24/7 news cycle. There isn't really, no one waits anymore. No one actually waits. And so I think that holds true for even how we approach the Trump administration. Sometimes it's better to just wait and see what is actually going to happen, because oftentimes they might say someone is out or about to be, and then 3 months pass by and that person is still in the cabinet. Same could go for Russia. Sometimes we think an indictment's coming and it's imminent, and then weeks later there's been no development. So I think the biggest also lesson we're learning is it doesn't hurt to just wait to get it right.
This is just a curiosity question of my own, but I've noticed that, well, they're all questions of my own, but this one's a little more pointed. I wonder why sometimes in news stories an aversion to calling an overt lie a lie, just to say, that was a lie. He lied. And I just wonder what your take is on that kind of skirting.
Well, it's difficult because I agree that it's fair to say there are many days where, whether it's the White House or the president, they are simply lying. And the New York Times and others have come up with these trackers to show how many times they have lied. Sometimes some of the networks have put in parentheses a real-time fact checks. So it might say Trump says X, Y, and Z, and in parentheses they say it's not true. But I think the problem becomes the intention. And so the sort of guide that a lot of newsrooms are having to grapple with is whether there is an intentional lie or whether the president simply doesn't know. Sometimes he is actually clueless and doesn't know what he's talking about, many times. But oftentimes, of course, you could say at a minimum they're being misleading. I think that the other issue is that readers are often turned off by the media being so explicit in saying that the White House is lying in the second line of your news story when you're reporting on what they may have said or done. And so they want to form their own opinions. Now, the question, of course, is, are we enabling them to perhaps form an opinion that is based on a lie and not really being clear with them about the fact that it is one? But usually the best rule of thumb is to just make it very clear in the second or third line of the story what the facts are. Oftentimes that is contradicting what the White House has said, and so it is right there for people to see without us spoon-feeding them and then turning them off because it sort of insults their intelligence. And that's just the reality of what we hear from a lot of people, especially across the country, is stop telling us what to think. But I think that what we have to do is just ensure that our reporting is based in truth and fact, and that it is made as clear as possible. And sometimes it could be made clear in the headline. So it could really just say Donald Trump, contradicting science, dispute climate change report. So it can be achieved in ways that are very clear without having to use language that turns readers or viewers off.
Now, circling back, just to close a little closure, do you think that these tenets or that the principles that you're kind of bringing out, your journey story, do you think that those were foundational, covered in Medill School of Journalism?
I think the fundamentals were there insofar as always ensuring that the facts are clear, ensuring that there is balance. And when I say balance, I mean reaching out to everyone who may be involved in a particular story or cited, giving an opportunity to comment at least, even if a story portrays one side in a negative light. And that when I say that, I don't mean that the reporter has done that. I mean that the story is damaging to one side. You still have to do your due diligence and ask that person if they have a statement or if they would like to comment for the piece. And so that way you have reflected that you have not just written it without even taking into account how one side may view an issue or a particular story. So all of that, in terms of the work that you're supposed to do as a reporter to come out with a piece that stands on its own, that was very much a part of my Medill experience. Mm-hmm. I don't think any journalism school anywhere could have prepared reporters for the Trump administration. And I just think that that's because we are living in a time that is unprecedented, and it also happens to coincide with the 24/7 news cycle that is probably at its peak, and because of all of the ways in which you can disseminate news, from TV to live streams to blogs to news organizations and print versus digital and social media, and there's just such an overwhelming amount of information that you can put out now as a reporter, as a journalist. And so how you train reporters to cover a White House that is also capitalizing on the way in which they can consume the news cycle and create a chicken and egg scenario where you don't know who's actually driving the story or the narrative, that's something that is just that can only be learned on the job. And making a lot of those decisions we talked about in terms of what should we cover and not cover, how do we approach a president whose White House is telling a lie, nearly every day, or at a minimum being misleading, floating conspiracy theories from the office of the presidency. I mean, these are real things that have happened regularly, who's flouted norms beyond any predecessors in terms of how the agencies and departments are handled, breaching what would be the purview of cabinet officials and the military. I mean, this is just not something that we've ever seen. So it's something that I think has to be learned in a newsroom and shouldn't be necessarily put on a journalism school to be able to grapple with. But what it does kind of then do is it returns those of us who are covering it back to the fundamentals.
Right. That's right.
If I just make sure that I have been clear in the piece about the facts, and I've gotten across the who, what, when, why, where, and how. I have reached out to everyone who's relevant for comment. I have not just come in here and done a half-baked job based on my own preconceived notions. I have gotten in as many voices as I can that are relevant to this piece. Then I think that I've done my job, and then those skills were very much taught to me inside those classrooms at Medill.
I really wanted to thank you for taking time out of your busy professional schedule to speak with us today. I wonder what today and the weekend will bring, but I think the president is on his way or in Argentina now for the G20. For anything you're working on now that you can tell us about?
Well, I think that we are all trying to work on what might be next for the Russia investigation, and that's been a big part of the post-midterm coverage, because after a little bit of a quiet period before the election, it now seems to be back in full force. And I'm very much focused on, as we go into the holidays and come back in January, what the new Congress will look like, particularly with respect to Democrats in control of the House and how they plan to use their investigative authorities, as well as their new legislative clout, to work with or not work with the Trump administration, as well as to act as a check and balance on the president. So I think that it's going to be a very wild ride, and suffice it to say, it's going to happen as the new presidential cycle is getting underway in a matter of months.
Well, so here we go again. Check in with you again. Yeah,
anytime.
That's right. Well, so thank you so much. I really appreciate your insights and conversation, Sabrina.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And thank you all for listening. My guest today is Sabrina Siddiqui. I'm Janet Lee. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Well, Don't Tell the Kids.